John Walker had lived in the Alaskan wilderness long enough to know its moods, but that February morning in 2023 felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones. At 54, he had spent decades as a hunting guide, teaching city folk how to track moose or bear, but today he was going out alone, just as he had done countless times before. He rose well before dawn, the old wooden floor of the cabin creaking under his boots as he moved quietly so he wouldn't wake his wife too soon. The air inside smelled faintly of pine from the wood stove, though the fire had died down hours earlier. On the wall hung the trophies of his career: mounted antlers, a bear pelt, and photographs of successful clients, each a reminder of the life he had built out here, far from the noise of cities. Linda appeared in the doorway, her robe pulled tight, her eyes still heavy with sleep but filled with concern. "Storm's coming later," she said, her voice low but firm. It wasn't the first time she had warned him. Alaska's weather was unpredictable, and storms could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. John offered the same smile he always did, a mix of reassurance and stubborn confidence. "I'll be back before it hits," he promised, leaning in to kiss her cheek. They had rehearsed this routine for years, but each time still carried the weight of possibility. She sighed, not entirely convinced, and let him go. Outside, the pre-dawn air bit at his face like needles. He loaded his pack into the truck with practiced efficiency, rifle checked, thermos filled with strong black coffee, jerky and dried fruit tucked away for the long day ahead. The engine grumbled to life, a tired sound in the frozen stillness. As he drove the 20 miles toward his favorite trailhead, the horizon began to shift from pitch black to the faintest shades of purple and blue. Snowbanks rose like walls along the road, reflecting the dim light. Occasionally, a raven crossed overhead, its wings stark against the pale sky. When John stepped out at the trailhead, the silence was so complete he could hear the crunch of each step echo off the trees. He pulled his coat tighter, the temperature already plunging near 20 below zero. The woods stretched before him like an endless canvas of white, a familiar landscape yet never quite the same from one day to the next. He paused for a moment, sipping from his thermos, watching his breath cloud the air. It was in that quiet pause, standing at the edge of the forest, he knew better than most men knew their own neighborhoods, that the day began to shift from routine into something far stranger. John adjusted the strap of his pack and started along the narrow trail, the snow crunching beneath his boots in a steady rhythm. He had walked this route hundreds of times before, and most mornings it told the same story. Moose had passed through during the night, a fox had left its delicate tracks across the surface, and sometimes wolves left the familiar patterns of their hunt. But today the snow wrote a different message, one that stopped him in his tracks after only a few minutes. Pressed deep into the powder were hoof prints, large and fresh, too large to be from a moose and too round to be from a caribou. John crouched down, brushing the edges with his gloved hand. A horse, he thought immediately. But wild horses in this part of Alaska were nearly unheard of, especially in the dead of winter when food was scarce. His frown deepened as he noticed the other prints mixed with them, wolf tracks, 5 or 6 at least, running alongside the horse's path. Not trailing it, not circling it, traveling together. He straightened slowly, his breath hanging in the frigid air. The hunter in him wanted to make sense of the signs, to piece together the story the ground was telling. Instinct said that wolves should have been pursuing the horse, their paws digging in as they closed in for a kill. But there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no frantic scattering of tracks. Instead, the lines of prints moved in harmony, side by side, as if the two species had chosen to walk as companions rather than enemies. John rubbed his chin, a habit when confusion set in. He had lived through storms that could bury cabins in a single night, had tracked bears across mountainsides, had guided wealthy tourists through terrain they barely understood. Yet in all those years, he had never seen anything like this. The wind shifted, carrying with it the dry whisper of snow sliding off spruce branches. Somewhere above, a raven croaked, the sound echoing in the silence. John tightened his grip on his rifle but didn't raise it. The prints were fresh, maybe only a few hours old, and curiosity pressed at him harder than caution. He knew he should probably turn back before the storm hit, but something in his gut told him that today wasn't like other days. Today was a day worth following. He adjusted the strap of his pack once more, pulled his scarf higher against the biting cold, and stepped carefully into the line of tracks. The trail wound deeper into the forest, each step pulling him further from routine and closer to a mystery that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The trail carried John through a narrow ravine where the wind funneled between stone walls and howled like a freight train. He pulled his hat lower over his ears and pressed on, the prince always steady in front of him, horse and wolf side by side as if they belonged together. The ravine opened suddenly into a clearing dusted in new snow, and what he saw made him stop so quickly his boots slid a few inches across the ice. 200 yards away, framed by scattered spruce trees, stood a horse unlike any he had ever seen. Its coat was the color of midnight, almost black against the snow, with a mane that whipped wildly in the icy wind. Tall, powerful, scarred from old battles, it looked less like a creature of flesh and blood and more like something carved out of the wilderness itself. John's heart hammered in his chest, but it wasn't the horse alone that froze him in place. 7 wolves circled nearby, their winter coats thick and silver gray. Some lay in the snow, others paced slowly, but none moved with the hunger of predators closing in for a kill. They drifted around the stallion with the ease of familiarity, and the horse stood calm, head occasionally lowering as if to acknowledge one of them. There was no panic, no tension, no sign of the violence John had expected. It was as if he had stumbled into a gathering, a meeting of old allies. His instincts kicked in, and he dropped to one knee, steadying his rifle out of habit, but his finger hovered away from the trigger. Through his binoculars, the details became sharper, each one more unsettling. The stallion's coat bore deep scars, healed but permanent, the marks of a life hard fought. The wolves, too, carried the stories of their survival. A grizzled muzzle here, a limp in the large male that seemed to be their leader, a jagged scar across one shoulder. This was not a pack of sleek young hunters. These were veterans of the wilderness, and somehow the horse had been folded into their ranks. John swallowed hard, the bitter taste of coffee still lingering on his tongue. He could feel the cold pressing in through his coat, but his focus was locked on the impossible scene. Every lesson his father had ever taught him, every rhythm of predator and prey he had come to rely on, was unraveling before his eyes. The wilderness demanded respect, his father had always said, but this was more than respect, it was a rewriting of the rules. The stallion shifted its weight, snow crunching softly beneath its hooves, and one of the wolves rose to move closer. Instead of bristling, the horse turned its head slightly, a subtle gesture that looked almost like approval. For a moment, John thought he saw something flash in the horse's mane, a glint of metal tangled deep where hair met scar, but the wind tugged it away before he could be sure. He lowered the binoculars, his breath catching in the frozen air. This was no ordinary encounter. He had walked into a secret the forest had guarded for years, and somehow he was the only witness. John stayed low, hidden behind a line of spruce trees, the rifle resting loosely across his knees while the binoculars remained pressed to his eyes. He expected the standoff to break at any moment, for instinct to overwhelm whatever strange peace held this gathering together. But as the sun climbed higher and shadows shortened across the clearing, something happened that made his pulse quicken in disbelief. A small group of wild boars emerged from the far side of the clearing, their snouts rooting noisily through the snow in search of hidden roots. Normally, the presence of wolves would have sent them scattering, but they seemed far less wary of the dark stallion standing in the open. The horse moved first, lowering its head and stepping deliberately toward the boars. The wolves followed, fanning out with practiced ease, each one slipping into position as though rehearsing a familiar pattern. John's breath fogged the lenses of his binoculars, and he had to wipe them clear with a trembling glove. He watched the stallion drive the boars subtly toward the wolves, its sheer size and presence forcing the animals to turn exactly where the pack wanted them. Then, in a coordinated burst, the wolves lunged from their positions, their timing so precise that the boars had no chance to scatter. The snow erupted in a flurry of movement, snarls cutting through the silence, and within moments the hunt was finished. John had seen wolves hunt before, fast, efficient, ruthless, but never like this. This was strategy, a joint effort that used the horse not as prey, but as a partner. The aftermath stunned him even more. The stallion did not retreat or defend itself as the wolves tore into the kill. Instead, it stood tall, head high, ears swiveling, scanning the forest as though keeping watch. One of the wolves, a smaller female, paused to glance at the horse before returning to the meal, a gesture that carried the weight of trust. When the wolves had eaten their fill, they stepped back, leaving enough behind for the stallion. John blinked, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes were telling him. He had heard old stories of horses chewing meat in desperate winters, but to witness it firsthand and in such harmony with predators defied everything he believed about the natural order. For nearly an hour he remained rooted to the spot, too entranced to notice the numbness creeping into his toes or the ache settling into his knees. The stallion finally lowered its head to nibble at both patches of exposed vegetation and scraps of the carcass, while the wolves lounged in the snow like sentinels resting after a shift. The forest was quiet again, save for the faint caw of a raven overhead. John exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath for longer than he thought. What he had witnessed wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't desperation. It was a partnership, a bond forged not from instinct, but from necessity, perhaps even something deeper. The wilderness, it seemed, still had secrets far greater than any trophy mounted on a cabin wall. The clearing had grown quiet after the hunt, the wolves sprawled in the snow with bellies full, the stallion still standing watch with the patience of a sentry. John was just lowering his binoculars when a new sound rolled through the trees, low and guttural, a sound he recognized instantly. His stomach tightened, a grizzly. The branches on the far side of the clearing shook as the massive bear lumbered into view, its thick coat dusted with frost, its muzzle already lifted to catch the scent of fresh blood. John froze where he knelt, every muscle taut, the cold forgotten in a surge of adrenaline. He had seen wolves scatter before at the arrival of a grizzly, and he braced for the same now, but what unfolded made his skin prickle. The stallion snorted sharply, ears pinned back, hooves stamping the snow in warning. The wolves stirred at once, rising from their rest, their hackles lifting like a row of bristles. The bear advanced, growling deep in its chest, eyes fixed on the carcass. John expected panic, but instead he saw unity. The stallion stepped forward, blocking the path to the kill, while the wolves fanned out at its flanks, forming a wall of muscle and teeth. The bear hesitated, surprised perhaps by the defiance. It rose on its hind legs, towering above them, roaring so loudly the sound seemed to rattle the trees. The stallion reared back, hooves flashing in the air, striking the ground with such force that the noise cracked like gunfire across the clearing. The wolves surged forward in unison, snarling and snapping, darting close enough to harry the bear without giving it the chance to land a blow. The grizzly swiped at the air, furious, but each time it lunged, the pack darted aside, biting at its legs, distracting it long enough for the stallion to charge. Snow flew in every direction as the great horse drove the bear back with sheer force, hooves pounding, eyes blazing with a ferocity that seemed born of both survival and loyalty. John's breath caught as he watched the impossible, predator and prey united against a greater threat. The bear finally faltered, unwilling to risk serious injury against such unexpected resistance. With a final huff, it dropped back to all fours and retreated into the trees, the sound of its heavy steps fading into the distance. Slowly, the wolves relaxed, their growls fading to low rumbles, while the stallion lowered its head, sides heaving with the effort but unbroken in spirit. For a long moment, silence reclaimed the clearing, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind through the branches. John realized he had been gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. He let out a long breath, lowering the weapon carefully. What he had just seen wasn't only survival, it was a defense born of trust, an alliance forged in danger. His father's old words echoed in his mind. The wilderness demands respect, but perhaps, John thought with a shiver, it also rewards those who learn to see beyond the old rules. The clearing had grown quiet after the hunt. The wolves sprawled in the snow with bellies full, the stallion still standing watch with the patience of a sentry. John was just lowering his binoculars when a new sound rolled through the trees, low and guttural, a sound he recognized instantly. His stomach tightened, a grizzly. The branches on the far side of the clearing shook as the massive bear lumbered into view, its thick coat dusted with frost, its muzzle already lifted to catch the scent of fresh blood. John froze where he knelt, every muscle taut, the cold forgotten in a surge of adrenaline. He had seen wolves scatter before at the arrival of a grizzly, and he braced for the same now, but what unfolded made his skin prickle. The stallion snorted sharply, ears pinned back, hooves stamping the snow in warning. The wolves stirred at once, rising from their rest, their hackles lifting like a row of bristles. The bear advanced, growling deep in its chest, eyes fixed on the carcass. John expected panic, but instead he saw unity. The stallion stepped forward, blocking the path to the kill, while the wolves fanned out at its flanks, forming a wall of muscle and teeth. The bear hesitated, surprised perhaps by the defiance. It rose on its hind legs, towering above them, roaring so loudly the sound seemed to rattle the trees. The stallion reared back, hooves flashing in the air, striking the ground with such force that the noise cracked like gunfire across the clearing. The wolves surged forward in unison, snarling and snapping, darting close enough to harry the bear without giving it the chance to land a blow. The grizzly swiped at the air, furious, but each time it lunged, the pack darted aside, biting at its legs, distracting it long enough for the stallion to charge. Snow flew in every direction as the great horse drove the bear back with sheer force, hooves pounding, eyes blazing with a ferocity that seemed born of both survival and loyalty. John's breath caught as he watched the impossible, predator and prey united against a greater threat. The bear finally faltered, unwilling to risk serious injury against such unexpected resistance. With a final huff, it dropped back to all fours and retreated into the trees, the sound of its heavy steps fading into the distance. Slowly, the wolves relaxed, their growls fading to low rumbles, while the stallion lowered its head, sides heaving with the effort but unbroken in spirit. For a long moment, silence reclaimed the clearing, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind through the branches. John realized he had been gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. He let out a long breath, lowering the weapon carefully. What he had just seen wasn't only survival, it was a defense born of trust, an alliance forged in danger. His father's old words echoed in his mind. The wilderness demands respect, but perhaps, John thought with a shiver, it also rewards those who learn to see beyond the old rules. The forest slowly settled after the grizzly's retreat, the only sound the crunch of shifting snow as the wolves resettled near the carcass. The stallion stood tall, breath steaming in the cold, but the tension in its muscles began to ease. John watched, his pulse still quick from what he had witnessed, when a smaller movement caught his eye. From the edge of the pack, one of the younger wolves trotted forward, its steps clumsy, still carrying the playful energy of youth. It approached the stallion, head cocked, tail flicking side to side in a mix of curiosity and mischief. The stallion lowered its head cautiously, but instead of showing fear, the wolf pup bounded up and pawed at the snow in front of the horse, then rose awkwardly on its hind legs. For a moment, the pup teetered there, chest puffed out as if trying to mimic the horse's rearing stance from only minutes earlier. Its little paws flailed in the air before it toppled back into the snow with a muffled thump. John almost laughed out loud, clapping a hand over his mouth to stifle the sound. The stallion snorted, tossing its mane, and nudged the pup gently with its nose, as though acknowledging the clumsy attempt. The other wolves glanced over, ears pricked, but soon returned to their resting places, leaving the youngster to its antics. The pup scrambled back up, shaking snow from its fur, then tried again, pushing onto its hind legs and swiping at the air. This time it managed a wobbling half stance before dropping back down. The stallion stamped its hoof, a sharp sound that made the pup jump, but the gesture didn't carry anger. It carried something closer to amusement. John felt a grin spread across his face despite the biting cold gnawing at his fingers. The wilderness could be brutal, unforgiving, and moments ago he had seen it at its most dangerous. Yet here in the same clearing, life revealed its playful side, a reminder that even in the harshest corners of the world there was room for joy. John lowered his binoculars, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if to make sure he wasn't imagining it all. His breath fogged the air and he chuckled softly to himself. "You've got more guts than sense, kid," he muttered under his breath, speaking as though the wolf pup could hear him. He knew he had just witnessed something few men would ever believe: a stallion and wolves not only surviving together, but sharing a moment of pure, unexpected levity. And for the first time all day, instead of feeling like a hunter or even an intruder, John felt like a guest at something rare, something secret, and something strangely beautiful. By the time John returned to his truck, the storm Linda had warned about was already pushing across the horizon, dark clouds rolling like a heavy curtain. The drive back to the cabin was slow, the windshield wipers struggling against sheets of snow, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was still in the clearing, replaying the images again and again. The stallion standing proud among wolves, the grizzly driven away by their combined force, the pup rising clumsily on its hind legs. Nothing in his decades of hunting had prepared him for that, and yet it felt more real than anything he had ever experienced with a rifle in his hands. When he finally stepped into the warmth of the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, Linda was waiting. She looked up from the fire, her worry plain. "You cut it close," she said, folding her arms, but her sharp tones softened when she saw his face. He wasn't just tired from the cold, he looked shaken, humbled. John set his pack down, pulled off his gloves, and dropped heavily into the chair by the stove. For a long moment, he just stared into the flames before speaking. "I saw something today," he said quietly. Linda moved closer, her hand resting on the back of his chair. Not a moose, not a bear, a horse out there in the snow, and wolves, but they weren't after it, they were with it. He paused, trying to find the words. "Linda, they hunted together. They fought off a grizzly together. I swear I saw a wolf pup try to mimic the horse. It was," he shook his head, still struggling to believe it himself. It was like watching the rules of nature turn upside down. Linda studied him, her brow furrowed, but there was no doubt in her eyes. After 30 years together, she knew when he was exaggerating and when he was deadly serious. "And what did you do?" she asked softly. John let out a long breath. "Nothing. I didn't even lift the rifle. I couldn't." For the first time in my life, the idea of pulling that trigger felt wrong, like I'd be killing something more than just an animal. He rubbed his face, the calluses on his hands rasping against his skin. "I think I've been looking at this land wrong, Linda. All those trophies on the wall, they don't feel like triumphs anymore. Not after what I saw today." She was silent for a moment, then reached down to squeeze his hand. "Maybe it's time to listen to that feeling," she said. Her voice carried neither judgment nor surprise, only quiet support. "You've always respected the wilderness. Maybe now it's showing you a different way to honor it." John looked up at the mounts lining the cabin walls, each one a story of pursuit and conquest. For the first time, they felt like relics from another man's life. Something inside him had shifted, something he couldn't put back the way it was. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would return to that clearing, and this time not as a hunter, but as a witness. Over the next several weeks, John found himself drawn back to the same valley again and again, always careful to keep his distance, always mindful of the wind so his scent wouldn't betray him. Each visit revealed something new. The way the stallion positioned itself at the edge of the pack during a hunt, the way the wolves deferred to it in silence, the strange rhythm of cooperation that seemed to grow stronger with time. His camera, once just another tool he carried on hunts for clients, now became his constant companion. He filled memory card after memory card, capturing images that even he struggled to believe when he looked at them later by the fire. It wasn't long before words slipped out. At first, it was just among a few friends in Healy, men he had known for years who raised their eyebrows when he spoke of a horse running with wolves. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but a few pressed him for proof. When John finally showed one of the photographs, a black stallion standing guard over a resting wolf pack, the reaction was immediate. Within days, a local newspaper called, then another, and before long, a journalist drove up from Fairbanks to hear his story firsthand. The article spread quickly, and soon the phone at the cabin began ringing more than John had ever wanted. Scientists, photographers, even television crews wanted to come. One voice stood out: Dr. Emily Grant, an animal behaviorist from the University of Alaska, who asked if she could join him on one of his observation trips. John hesitated, worried about exposing the animals to too much attention, but something in her tone carried respect rather than exploitation. He agreed, and a week later they hiked into the valley together. When Emily first raised her binoculars, she gasped so loudly John almost chuckled. "This," she whispered, "is behavioral adaptation at its finest. They've rewritten the rules." Her enthusiasm was genuine, and John felt a small measure of relief knowing that at least one outsider saw the wonder instead of just the spectacle. Still, not everyone came with the same reverence. A pair of eager photographers arrived one morning without warning, their snowmobiles rattling across the frozen ground. The noise startled the wolves, sending them bolting into the tree line, the stallion thundering after them. John's jaw clenched as he confronted the men, his voice sharper than he intended. "This isn't a zoo. You don't get to barge in and scare them off." The photographers muttered excuses, but the damage was done. For 3 long days afterward, the valley remained empty, the tracks gone as if the animals had vanished into thin air. When they finally returned, John felt an almost personal relief wash over him. The wolves and the stallion moved as though nothing had happened, but he knew better. They had been disturbed, and it was a reminder of how fragile their secret truly was. Sitting with Linda that evening, he admitted, "The world's going to know about them sooner or later, but it's our job to make sure they're protected, not turned into somebody's headline." She nodded, her hand warm on his, and he realized that his role had shifted again, not just a witness now, but a guardian of something far bigger than himself. Spring came slowly to Alaska, the deep snows melting into rushing streams and patches of green pushing through the ground. On one of his early April trips, John hiked into the valley with his camera slung across his chest, unsure if the stallion and wolves would still be there after the long winter. For 3 days he found nothing but old tracks and silence, and worry gnawed at him. But on the 4th morning, as the sun broke over the ridges, he spotted fresh prints leading higher into the hills. He followed them with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the forest, and what he discovered made him stop in awe. The stallion stood in a grassy meadow, its coat beginning to shed the thick winter hair, scars visible along its flanks but eyes still sharp and alive. Around it lay the familiar pack of wolves, but now there were new shapes among them. Tiny gray bundles tumbling through the grass, wolf pups wrestling and yipping in the spring air. John raised his binoculars, his breath catching as he realized what he was seeing. The horse didn't simply tolerate their presence, it guarded them. When one pup strayed too far, the stallion nudged it back gently with its muzzle. Another scrambled clumsily up one of its legs, clinging for balance until it slid back down into the grass. The great animal stood patient, almost parental, as if it had accepted the pups as part of its family. John lowered the binoculars slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, the words slipping out with a mixture of disbelief and delight. It was one thing to see survival strategies between predators and prey, but this was trust, the kind that could only grow over time. The wolves no longer treated the stallion as an outsider. Together, they had become something entirely new, something the wilderness had rarely allowed, a blended family, united not just by need but by bond. Back at the cabin, John shared his discovery with Linda, showing her the photographs he had taken. Her eyes softened as she studied the images of pups climbing across the stallion's legs. "They're raising them together," she said quietly, almost as if afraid to disturb the magic of it. John nodded. "It's more than I ever expected. And it feels wrong to just keep it to myself." Their daughter, Rachel, home from college for the summer, overheard the conversation. She had grown up hearing her father's stories about the wilderness, but had never seen him so moved. "If this is real, Dad," she said, "people should learn from it. Not just scientists, kids, families, anyone who thinks nature is only about fighting." Her words stayed with him, and over the months that followed, the idea took root. The hunting trophies on his cabin walls began to come down, replaced by framed photographs of Spirit and the wolves. With Linda's support and Rachel's enthusiasm, John began laying the groundwork for something new. Not a hunting business, but a small conservation and photography tour service, one that would show others the wonder he had been privileged to witness. Years slipped by, each one marked not by the trophies John once hung on his cabin walls, but by the photographs he now captured. His old hunting cabin transformed into something different, a warm visitor lodge filled with framed images of Spirit and the wolves. Tourists from across the country began to trickle in, drawn not by the promise of a kill, but by the chance to glimpse the extraordinary bond between predator and prey that had become a family. Scientists published papers, teachers used John's photographs in classrooms, and Rachel took a leading role in guiding visitors, her passion for wildlife shining as brightly as her father's once had for the hunt. Still, John knew nothing lasted forever. Spirit grew older, the one stark coat sprinkled with gray, movements slowing though the fire in its eyes never dimmed. The wolves, too, changed with the seasons, new alphas rising, old veterans fading, but the partnership endured. One autumn evening, long after the lodge had emptied of guests, John stood on the porch with Linda, coffee steaming in their mugs. The sky above blazed with the northern lights, ribbons of green and purple dancing across the heavens. And there, at the edge of the meadow, he thought he saw a silhouette, the proud curve of a stallion's neck, the faint shapes of wolves gathered close. For a heartbeat, he couldn't tell if it was memory, imagination, or something more. But when the distant echo of a wolf's howl carried through the cold night air, followed by what sounded like the soft nickering of a horse, John smiled. The wilderness still held its secrets, but he had been fortunate enough to witness one of them, and it had changed him forever. He turned to Linda, squeezing her hand. "You know," he said softly, "maybe the greatest trophies aren't the ones you hang on a wall. Maybe they're the lessons you carry with you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the lights ripple until they faded into the dark. And for those who would one day hear the story of Spirit and the wolves, the lesson remained clear. Survival is not always about conquest. Sometimes it is about trust, unity, and the courage to see beyond the old boundaries. If you felt moved by this story, let it remind you that nature still has mysteries that can inspire us to live with greater respect and compassion. If you believe in loyalty, courage, and the beauty of unexpected friendships, this tale will stay with you long after it ends. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart, comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true-to-life stories about wildlife, resilience, and the bonds that surprise us most.